Chuck Norris doesn't fall asleep. Sleep gently falls into Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't count sheep. The sheep count themselves and tiptoe away from Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need to close his eyes to go to sleep. The stars dim themselves to help Chuck Norris to fall asleep. Chuck Norris doesn't have nightmares when he sleeps. Nightmares have Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't snore. His breathing becomes a lullaby that soothes the whole world. Chuck Norris doesn't need an alarm clock. Time itself waits for Chuck Norris to rise. Chuck Norris doesn't roll over in bed. The bed shifts quietly to keep Chuck Norris comfortable. Chuck Norris doesn't need a blanket. The night wraps Chuck Norris gently in its calm. Chuck Norris doesn't dream of places. Places dream of being visited by Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't toss and turn. The bed stays perfectly still, waiting on Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't struggle with insomnia. Even insomnia takes the night off for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need a bedtime story. Stories tell themselves, hoping to be heard by Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't rest his head. The pillow rests gratefully beneath Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't take melatonin. Melatonin asks permission from Chuck Norris to help others. Chuck Norris doesn't wish for sweet dreams. Sweet dreams line up, waiting to be chosen by Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't ask people to like and subscribe. Even in their dreams, people find themselves liking and subscribing when they hear Chuck Norris. And if you're still awake, you can like and subscribe too, for more soothing stories and unusual facts to help you drift peacefully into dreams. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. The earth moves down for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't read books. Books open themselves and reveal their secrets to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need a GPS. Wherever Chuck Norris stands becomes the destination. Chuck Norris doesn't need a key. Locks unlock themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't wear a watch. Time follows Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't turn on the lights. The dark turns itself off for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't open doors. Doors step aside for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't check the weather. The weather checks with Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't take a path. The ground shapes itself into a road for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't swim in the ocean. The water carries Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need a mirror. Mirrors reflect themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't call for silence. Silence arrives for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need directions. The world turns itself toward Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't chase the bus. The bus waits for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't knock on doors. Doors open before Chuck Norris arrives. Chuck Norris doesn't search for Wi-Fi. Signals connect themselves to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need to charge his phone. Batteries stay full around Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't type passwords. Computers unlock themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't take out the trash. The trash takes itself out for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't pour water. The glass fills itself for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't mow the lawn. The grass cuts itself for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't cook dinner. Meals prepare themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't fold laundry. Clothes lie neatly in place for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need music. Songs play on their own for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't tie his shoes. Shoelaces knot themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't drive cars. Cars drive themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't wait in line. Lines dissolve for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't water plants. The rain shows up for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't dial numbers. Phones call themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't take photos. Cameras capture themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't climb mountains. Mountains lower themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't write letters. Words arrange themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't make wishes. Wishes make themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need maps. The world orients itself around Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't cross bridges. Bridges carry themselves to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't wait for elevators. Elevators rush to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't play instruments. Music plays itself for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't draw pictures. Images sketch themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't carve statues. Stone shapes itself for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't ring bells. Bells chime on their own for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't strike matches. Flames light themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need roads. Destinations come to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't play games. Games play themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't lift weights. Weights rise out of respect for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't build houses. Walls stand up on their own for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't paint walls. Colors spread themselves for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't need to learn. Knowledge introduces itself to Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't look at the stars. The stars look at Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris doesn't chase dreams. Dreams chase Chuck Norris. When Chuck Norris stubs his toe, the furniture cries. Chuck Norris once built a snowman out of fire. Chuck Norris's Wi-Fi signal never drops. The internet clings to him. When Chuck Norris goes camping, bears hide their food. Chuck Norris once counted past infinity just to see what was there. The speed of light slows down to let Chuck Norris pass. Chuck Norris once punched the ground and invented earthquakes. Chuck Norris once ate soup with a fork and finished it. Chuck Norris can high-five gravity. When Chuck Norris plays cards, aces ask permission. Chuck Norris once kicked the ocean. That's how tsunamis happen. Chuck Norris's internet has no lag. Lag is afraid of him. When Chuck Norris goes fishing, fish volunteer. Chuck Norris's pillow sleeps on him. Chuck Norris once timed a microwave by blinking. Chuck Norris can talk to walls, and they respond. When Chuck Norris cooks, ingredients season themselves. When Chuck Norris whistles, the wind harmonizes. Chuck Norris once challenged a glacier. Now we have ice cubes. Chuck Norris doesn't need traffic lights. Cars stop on sight. Chuck Norris can make shadows sweat. Chuck Norris once drank lava for fun. When Chuck Norris points at the sky, stars realign. Chuck Norris once asked for a glass of water and got a waterfall. Chuck Norris's footprints fossilize instantly. When Chuck Norris sings, echoes applaud. Chuck Norris once arm wrestled himself and won. Twice. When Chuck Norris hums, bees follow. Chuck Norris's shoelaces never untie out of fear. When Chuck Norris touches metal, it polishes itself. When Chuck Norris waves, trees bow. Chuck Norris once looked at ice cream. It melted. When Chuck Norris stares at glass, it turns to crystal. Chuck Norris's phone never runs out of storage. Files delete themselves. When Chuck Norris nods, mountains move. Chuck Norris's laughter can power a city. Chuck Norris's coffee is afraid to cool down. When Chuck Norris ties a knot, it becomes permanent. Chuck Norris's shadow never leaves. It's loyal. When Chuck Norris crosses a desert, it rains. Chuck Norris can whistle underwater. When Chuck Norris shakes hands, bones heal. Chuck Norris once cooked rice in 10 seconds. Chuck Norris's hair grows out of respect. When Chuck Norris lifts a finger, death once had a near Chuck Norris experience. Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice. When Chuck Norris enters a room, he turns the dark off. The boogeyman checks under his bed for Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris beat the sun in a staring contest. Chuck Norris can kill 2 stones with 1 bird. Chuck Norris's tears cure illness. Too bad he has never cried. Chuck Norris once made a Happy Meal cry. The flu gets a Chuck Norris shot every year. Chuck Norris can slam a revolving door. Chuck Norris doesn't call wrong numbers. You answered the wrong phone. Chuck Norris once roundhouse kicked someone so hard, history was rewritten. Chuck Norris can divide by 0. Chuck Norris doesn't need Google. Google needs Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris can unscramble an egg. Chuck Norris's shadow can bench press 500 pounds. Chuck Norris can dribble a bowling ball. The reason Waldo is hiding is Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris once gave CPR to a grizzly bear. The bear survived out of respect. When Chuck Norris does push-ups, he doesn't push himself up. He pushes the earth down. Chuck Norris once played Jenga with the pyramids. When Chuck Norris jumps in a pool, he doesn't get wet. The water gets Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris can hear sign language. The calendar skips April Fool's Day. No one fools Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris once went swine diving, but his parachute refused to open out of fear. He landed safely anyway. Chuck Norris's handshake has its own time zone. Chuck Norris's reflection once winked first. Chuck Norris once ate an entire pizza before the delivery guy left his car. Chuck Norris can slam the cloud storage door. Chuck Norris once kicked a horse in the chin. That's why giraffes exist. Chuck Norris can make onions cry. When Chuck Norris was born, he drove his mom home from the hospital. Chuck Norris can light a fire by rubbing 2 ice cubes together. Chuck Norris once ordered a steak in a vegetarian restaurant and got one. Ghosts sit around the campfire and tell Chuck Norris stories. Chuck Norris can sneeze with his eyes open. Chuck Norris can unscramble Rubik's Cubes by staring at them. Chuck Norris can win Monopoly without owning property. Chuck Norris once beat rock, paper, and scissors all at the same time. Chuck Norris's smile once started a forest fire. Chuck Norris doesn't wear shoes. The ground protects his feet. Chuck Norris's diary is now the Guinness Book of World Records. Chuck Norris can remember the future. Chuck Norris invented airplanes because walking on air was too slow. Chuck Norris once kicked the speed of light. Now we call it time travel. Chuck Norris can fry an egg on ice. Chuck Norris doesn't blink. The world pauses. Chuck Norris's keyboard doesn't have backspace. He never makes mistakes. Chuck Norris once sneezed and created a hurricane. Chuck Norris's favorite color is lightning. Chuck Norris doesn't do math. Numbers solve themselves to please him. Chuck Norris once punched a volcano and made diamonds. Chuck Norris can text faster on a rotary phone than you can on a smartphone. Chuck Norris once beat the internet in a staring contest. The Loch Ness Monster quit hiding after seeing Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris once played basketball with the moon. He won. Chuck Norris's DNA is made of steel and coffee. When Chuck Norris walks into the ocean, fish beach themselves out of respect. Chuck Norris once kicked gravity. Now planets orbit him. Chuck Norris can cut a knife with butter. When Chuck Norris looks at Medusa, she turns to stone. Chuck Norris's GPS has only one direction, his way. Chuck Norris can breathe in space without a suit. Chuck Norris's fists are measured on the Richter scale. Chuck Norris can lift himself by pulling his own hair. Chuck Norris once bit an apple and discovered gravity. Chuck Norris can plug a USB and write on the first try. Chuck Norris once told time to wait, and it did. Chuck Norris can make ice melt by staring at it in the freezer. When Chuck Norris enters Wi-Fi range, the signal gets stronger. Chuck Norris's phone battery lasts forever, out of fear. Chuck Norris can turn tea into coffee by looking at it. Chuck Norris once made a cow give chocolate milk. Chuck Norris doesn't need stairs, he jumps floors. Chuck Norris can jump higher than a skyscraper. Skyscrapers can't jump. Chuck Norris once folded paper more than 7 times. Chuck Norris doesn't mow the grass. it bows down. Chuck Norris can drink boiling water. Chuck Norris once opened a book so hard the alphabet came out. Chuck Norris can make a snowman in the desert. Chuck Norris's shoes don't wear out. The ground does. Chuck Norris once clapped with one hand. Chuck Norris can whistle while eating crackers. Chuck Norris can make a house of cards in a hurricane. Chuck Norris once played tennis against himself and won twice. Chuck Norris once built a time machine out of Legos. Chuck Norris's shadow runs faster than light. Chuck Norris once turned down a Nobel Prize. It wasn't enough. Chuck Norris once sneezed in space. Now we have asteroids. Chuck Norris can count backward past 0. Chuck Norris doesn't use elevators. Elevators rise for him. Chuck Norris once watched a pot of water boil instantly. Chuck Norris can fry bacon with his breath. Chuck Norris once made a GPS recalculate out of fear. Chuck Norris's heart beats thunder. Chuck Norris once broke the speed of dark. Chuck Norris can make a computer crash just by staring at it. Chuck Norris once jumped off the Empire State Building and went up. Chuck Norris can bite into soup. Chuck Norris doesn't need introductions. Everyone already knows Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris's gaze bends mirrors. Chuck Norris once threw a pebble. Now we have meteors. When Chuck Norris thinks, satellites realign. Chuck Norris's shoes leave permanent trails. Chuck Norris once smiled. Flowers bloomed instantly. When Chuck Norris whistles, wolves gather. Chuck Norris's sigh makes rainbows. Chuck Norris once burped and shifted the atmosphere. Chuck Norris once hiccuped, and the earth skipped a rotation. When Chuck Norris stretches, skylines widen. Chuck Norris once blinked and shadows vanished. When Chuck Norris frowns, deserts bloom. Chuck Norris once pointed, and rivers flowed backward. Chuck Norris's footsteps scare mountains. Chuck Norris once whistled and summoned birds from every direction. When Chuck Norris smiles, glaciers melt. Chuck Norris's eyes sparkle brighter than constellations. Chuck Norris once stared at a clock. It struck midnight instantly. When Chuck Norris breathes, smoke clears. Chuck Norris once shouted, and avalanches moved aside. Chuck Norris once coughed, and stars rearranged. When Chuck Norris grins, storms retreat. Chuck Norris's grin straightens crooked buildings. When Chuck Norris raises his hand, silence falls worldwide. Chuck Norris once tapped the ground, geysers erupted. Chuck Norris's fingerprints leave permanent heat marks. Chuck Norris once touched the ocean. It tasted like lemonade. Chuck Norris's sneeze invented fireworks. When Chuck Norris winks, planets tilt. Chuck Norris once nodded, and calendars skipped a day. Chuck Norris once coughed. Clouds reshaped into animals. Chuck Norris once laughed softly, and auroras appeared. Chuck Norris once raised an eyebrow. Continents shifted. Chuck Norris once bit into lightning and smiled. Chuck Norris once stomped and volcanoes erupted. When Chuck Norris shakes his head, tornadoes disappear. Chuck Norris once cracked his knuckles. Tectonic plates moved. When Chuck Norris folds his arms, time zones merge. Chuck Norris once blinked twice, and eclipses formed. Chuck Norris once tapped a mountain, it turned to sand. Chuck Norris once clapped his hands, waterfalls reversed. Chuck Norris once opened his palm, winds obeyed. Chuck Norris once snapped a twig, thunder roared. Chuck Norris once sighed, deserts turned green. Chuck Norris once raised his voice, glaciers cracked. Chuck Norris once tilted his head, shadows realigned. Chuck Norris once breathed out, storms dissolved. Chuck Norris once touched a flame, it cooled. Chuck Norris once blinked at lightning, it froze midair. Chuck Norris once sat down, mountains lowered in respect. And that's it for tonight's Chuck Norris jokes. If you enjoyed them, remember to like and subscribe. After all, Chuck Norris doesn't click subscribe. Subscribe clicks itself for Chuck Norris.